Well, one of the most difficult and interesting cases that I had to handle when I was the state attorney of Israel is that one day someone who came from Poland had entered the Israeli Secret Service, and our intelligence people received information that he was a spy from Poland who was sent here in order to infiltrate into the Israeli Secret Service. And there was someone who gave us information who came from Poland, and that's why the man was arrested and charged. Now he denied, of course, that he had done anything wrong, and he said that his line was, and his lawyer tried to prove, that the intelligence tried to create a story, a false story about this client, about this accused person, because he threatened to publish some illegal acts of the intelligence service. And that, of course, was very dangerous also on the inside, because this man had many friends inside the intelligence service. And they began to believe maybe that someone was inventing something against this man. So it was a very serious thing. Now, I was then in the state attorney's office. I usually appeared only before the Supreme Court. But this was such a serious business that the head of the intelligence asked me whether I was prepared to handle this case in first instance before the district court. And well, the trial took about 3 years, because there were dozens of witnesses and lots of sort of jigsaw puzzle evidence. And this man was very clever. He had, at a certain stage, he told his superiors in the Secret Service that he had been approached by some people from the Polish embassy, whether he was prepared to do some espionage work for them. And then, of course, if they had said, and he said, then maybe I pretend that I'll do that, and then, of course, I can give you information. But in fact, he really was a Polish spy. He was not only a double agent, he wanted to become a triple agent. And, well, they refused that, but I don't want to go into every details. I had about 30 or 40 different points of circumstantial evidence, and I finally managed to prove that he was guilty, and he was sentenced to, I think, 12 years imprisonment, and he appealed. Now, a lot of the things that I had brought forward to the court was a little bit of guesswork. I tried to explain this evidence, and I thought the reasons for this, and a little bit of guesswork. So suddenly we received information from France that a Polish spy had escaped to France and was gone over to the West. And he told of all his experiences. Amongst other things, he described how a Polish spy was introduced into the Israeli Secret Service, and with all this, even all the things that I used by guesswork were proved true. Now, the French gave that to the Israeli authorities, but on condition that it would not be used in any trial, because they wanted to use that spy for their own, as an agent for the French intelligence. Now, the lawyer of this person, of this accused person, whose name was Levy, not the lawyer, the accused was named called Levy. The lawyer was a very famous lawyer in Israel, very right-wing. And he said, of course, I cannot defend someone, I would not defend someone who worked for the communists and so on. But I'm sure that the man is innocent. This was just bad faith on the part of the intelligence. And he said, if ever you prove to me that this man is really guilty, and I don't believe you will, but if you can prove that to me, then I'll make him confess. I'll see to it that he will confess before the court. Now, here I had this information from France, but I couldn't use it. So the appeal started, and the defense argued for 5 or 6 days, and then it was my turn, and it was very difficult. Even the judges, I saw it was going one way or the other. And then suddenly, while I argued on the fourth day, I received a note that this Polish spy in France had been murdered in a French prison. And that the French were no longer interested to keep it a secret. So I asked for a break. I showed the defense counsel all the materials they had. The man went pale, but in any case, next day the man confessed. I mean, this is one of the interesting stories, but one of the most difficult cases that I had to handle.
Now, you also were telling me about a bishop.
Yes, there was a famous Archbishop Capucci. Now, Capucci was a Muslim, and he was an archbishop, one of the Christian faiths, and he lived in Lebanon, and he came quite often to Israel. And no one suspected him of anything. I mean, here, an archbishop, you know, he came in with his attire, black attire, and a great cross. And whenever he came from the Lebanon, he was not examined. Now, then it later turned out that he was, at the request of Arafat, he sent Katyusha rockets into Israel, and was all the time, and high explosives, and weapons, and all kinds of things to the terrorists, and it was a definite, a very major agent for the terrorist organizations. Now, how did suddenly the suspicion arise? One day he came he asked the police to investigate that. He said that there had been a burglary in his flat and that $100,000 had been stolen from his apartment. And I want to add, we realized later that he didn't do it only out of patriotism, or Muslim Arab patriotism, but he had lots of girlfriends. And he needed a lot of money, and he got a lot of money from Arafat and his associates to bring these arms and high explosives into Israel. Now, then he called, as I said, he told the police about this burglary, and they opened a file, and a few days later, a policeman came to him and said, could you tell us from which bank you got these notes, because maybe they have the numbers of these notes, and that it might be easier for us to catch the thieves, the burglars. So then the Archbishop hesitated, and then he said, well, in that case, I'll withdraw my complaint. And that, of course, raised some red lights. And next time when he came from Lebanon, his car was examined. It was full of high explosives and rockets and things like that. And not only that, but they found that on his previous visit, he had left some rockets, and the police managed to dismantle these rockets 10 minutes before they were supposed to get off, and they were standing on a hill. They were placed on a hill overlooking Jerusalem. They could have hit any of the holy places if they had gone on. And well, he was put on trial. The journalists were a bit angry. I handled the case, and the journalists expected me to bring all the details about the man's girlfriends. But I didn't think this necessary. We had full proof that he brought these weapons, and he didn't even deny that. So I didn't bring in the girlfriends. So the police, the journalists were a bit disappointed. Also, there was an argument. Some people thought that he should be there dressed as a prisoner, in prisoner's outfit. I objected to this. I said, this man is an archbishop. He has not yet been found guilty. We just started. There's a presumption of innocence, and therefore he should be permitted to go in his ordinary official attire. It was quite an interesting case. But one interesting item about this: the day on which I proved in court how these rockets that he brought into Israel at the request of Arafat, how they were placed there and could have hit any of the holy places, on that very day, Israel was censured by the United Nations for having carried out historical excavations in the old city. You see, on the day on which we proved that, and at the request of the Arab society, Arafat and these people had complained to the Security Council. So Israel was censured for some historical excavations in the old city. That was on the day on which we proved that Arafat sent rockets that could have destroyed all of the holy places in the holy city. And well, that was rather typical for what we had to experience, but that was also quite one of the interesting cases. Yeah.
Meyer Lansky, you talked a little bit about this the other night. Yesterday we had a chance to talk to your lovely wife, and she was talking about her father going over to the United States, raising money, and part of that source of funding may have been relationships with Meyer Lansky.
Not only with him.
Well, with others.
With many others.
Many, but I found that whole connect kind of interesting. And yet, a few years later, you get an application for citizenship from Meyer Lansky. Did your wife ever mention Yehuda's contact with Meyer Lansky?
No. Well, we knew about it, but that had no connection whatsoever, not one way or the other. I mean, he didn't have, it was not a personal, strong relationship between Yehuda Arazi and Meyer Lansky. I mean, there was, Yehuda Arazi, when he was in America, and we urgently, money was needed to buy arms for Israel, which was just immediately after the declaration of the state, and lots of people thought that Israel would be destroyed within a few weeks, and there were no arms at all available, very little, and so he collected money from all kinds of sources. So some of these people of the underworld apparently gave some money. I don't know how much, contributed something, but Yehuda Arazi, I'm sure he didn't go into the details of the career. So
it was surrounded in the atmosphere of democracy.
Yes, quite. So I thought that was rather interesting to hear that they had met. But anyway, that didn't influence my action in one way or the other.
Well, let's just talk about your action. You were in the state attorney's office, and you get the application. It's a written document, I'm sure, from Meyer Lansky requesting citizenship.
No, I didn't know. The application was given to the Ministry of Interior.
Okay.
It wasn't given to me. I was when Meyer Lansky asked to become an Israeli citizen, and under the law of return, every Jew has a right to become a citizen. But there are some exceptions. If you acted against the Jewish people, or if you are ill, I mean, this sort of thing, of course, was not relevant. But there's one exception, which says that if a person, because of his criminal past in his home country, is likely to endanger the safety of the state of Israel, inside in this or that way, then the Minister of Interior can refuse to grant him citizenship. Now, that question arose when Meyer Lansky asked for citizenship, and people knew that he was regarded as one of the serious gangsters in America. So the question came up, could this exception be used? But the difficulty was for the Israel government that they knew, they heard the man had never been convicted of any criminal crime, except 20 years before that, when he got a 3-month sentence for gambling. So his lawyer, with a certain degree of logic, said that doesn't mean that he has a criminal past, that 20 years ago he got a 3-month sentence for gambling, and even if it is a criminal past, that does not mean that today he can endanger the safety of the state of Israel because of such a conviction. And therefore he insisted that he should be given that right. So the government, and actually through the Minister of Interior, applied to me to make an investigation, because there was actually hardly any proof. The only thing they could give me was that the Reader's Digest had in one of their articles had something about him, but that certainly is not sufficient proof to deprive this man of a right which every person in Israel, as a Jew who is new, if he wants to be a new immigrant, can use. So I came to the United States. I spent a couple of weeks in Washington with people, and at first I met Mitchell, the Attorney General, and John Mitchell, and that was 2 weeks before Watergate started. So I had a very interesting discussion. He came and he said he was delighted that I was sent by the Israel government, because the American people here, they were afraid that Israel, because that man had hundreds of millions of dollars at his disposal, that we didn't try to investigate his past and so on. And therefore he said that they didn't apply to the Israel ambassador in America on this issue because they didn't want to raise the suspicion that America was interfering in the internal decisions of the state of Israel. But the fact that I came gave him great satisfaction. And we had a very interesting talk. He told me about the development of the underworld in America in every field. And then he gave instructions to open all the files before me that could be relevant to Lansky. And I had a most interesting time with people in Washington and apart from that. And then I came back and I convinced the Minister of Interior not to grant this man, Meyer Lansky, Israeli citizenship. Lansky then applied to the Supreme Court. He filed an action against the Israel government for refusing to grant him Israeli citizenship. And I appeared in that case. And many people had doubts whether I would succeed, but I did. And I made a lot of use of the Kefauver Committee reports and of the internal evidence in America. So that was also quite a fascinating case. There were some people who criticized me in Israel. They said, "Oh, this man now, Lansky, is over 70, and you now try to prove what the American police for dozens of years was not able to prove. And why do you do that?" And so on. All this kind of self-hatred and so on. Well, I was convinced that Israel had become a sort of really a sort of borderline position, that we really what sort of a state we were becoming. And I didn't want that Israel should be a haven for people of that kind. And the American police had told me, or not police, the people in Washington had told me that there were lots of people who were waiting for the outcome of that case in Israel, because they felt that if Lansky would be permitted to stay, anyone could have a chance. And I received information in the middle of that case that from New Scotland Yard in England, that they'd overheard a telephone conversation between two gangsters, one in London and one in Zurich. And they wanted to have a summit meeting of the underworld in Israel with Lansky. And I was asked by the American police and by international police to grant these people entry into Israel and to cover their tracks, to find out what they were doing, what they were planning. Now, that could have helped me in my case against Lansky, but I refused to accept that, and we didn't let these people in because I didn't want to put Israel on the map as a place where international crime syndicates have their summit meetings. But I did use that telegram from that I received from New Scotland Yard to show in court that the Minister of Interior was sort of not acting beyond the rules of common sense when he decided not to grant this man citizenship. Well, there were 5 judges. They all agreed with me. There was one interesting point during the discussions with the judges. I handed in the report of the Kefauver Committee, Senate Investigation Committee on crime, and Lansky was summoned before that the Kiefer Committee with his lawyer. And he was asked, do you know Al Capone? He said, yes. Do you know Lucky Luciano? Yes. Do you know Genovese? Yes. I mean, all the big gangsters. And then they said, what business do you have with Al Capone? He said, I refuse to answer because the answer might incriminate me. And what business did you have with Lucky Luciano? The same. So when I put that in, and I read it out, the judge, the president of the Supreme Court in Israel asked me, tell me, do you mean to say that because that man pleaded the Fifth Amendment before in America, or in America before the Kiefer Committee report, that because of that, your minister could decide that he is a criminal? I said no. So they asked me, why waste our time then? I said, no, it's not a waste of time, because there were about 8 or 9 witnesses before the Kiefer Committee who testified that this man, Lansky, was one of the most dangerous criminals in the United States, not only in gambling, but in every other field. And then when I was going to say, the fact that this man pleaded the Fifth Amendment, that in itself doesn't show that he's a criminal, but it strengthens the case based on the other evidence, because every fair-minded person will ask himself, if these people said something against him before the Kiefer Committee, was this man given a chance to repudiate that? Was he given a chance to clear himself? And the fact that he was given that chance, and that when they asked him questions he refused to answer because the answer might incriminate him, that added to the power and the strength of the evidence, negative evidence against him. And the Kiefer Committee held that he was one of the most dangerous criminals. So that also justified the actions of the minister, and the court accepted that. Lansky had to return to the United States, and was there first put on trial, and then he was first convicted, but then he was acquitted on appeal because the evidence was based on other gangsters who were also not very reliable. And but finally I felt that Israel had a sort of crossroads, and that by doing this, by fighting this case and by persuading the minister not to grant him citizenship, I think I had done something to save the good name of the State of Israel.
Was there always some story about how the gangsters or the mafia viewed Meyer Lansky when they would,
Yeah, well, one of the pieces of evidence that I got in America was something that they thought they could never use because it was illegally obtained. They had put up a microphone inside the headquarters of one of the gangsters' places, hiding places in America, and there they had overheard a conversation where one of the leading gangsters there said, the only Jew we respect is Meyer Lansky, although we know that what remains for us from the gambling casinos is only what remains after what he steals from the various casinos. And that was rather funny to watch. But of course, I mean, as I said, this is something the American police told us that they couldn't use that in any court proceedings. Also, it would be hearsay evidence, of course. But here, this was not a criminal case. I had to prove that the Minister of Interior in Israel acted according to common sense and proper considerations. So, of course, that was relevant for me to show to the minister.
Great story. What was your impressions of John Mitchell, our Attorney General?
Well, I have been very, very often asked what my impression. I must say I had a very favorable impression, and even what I heard afterwards, when the Watergate started, I felt that that was something separate. It did not cover. I had the impression that when he described how he was fighting the underworld and what he did, and altogether, I thought that whatever he said and whatever I saw that he acted was done in good faith. So maybe that's all the things that had to do with elections is a sort of watertight compartment. I don't want to express an opinion on that. But all in all, I was very much impressed by him.
Did you have any connections with the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's office at all when you were doing the investigation?
Well, indirectly, of course, I got all the files opened from the FBI and everything. They gave everything to me. I spent 3 weeks, and the people in Washington, I don't know whether Mitchell really intended to open everything, but they did. There was this, they said, all the files, anything which could be relevant should be shown to me. So I had all the internal and the most secret inside information was shown to me. So that was really rather impressive. And they told me stories not only about the people of the Jewish faith, but also of all other kinds of underworld characters who were very dangerous, and they knew they were dangerous, but they couldn't prove anything against them. Mm-hmm. And they had that difficulty, and they really confided into some things which were fascinating, although rather frightening to read.
Did you get a sense, was there much Jewish involvement, aside from a Meyer Lansky, in the American Mafia? Was it a...
There were a number of Jewish characters. I can't say influence of the Jewish Mafia and all the other organizations, but there were some, in addition to Lansky. They mentioned a number of people, his assistants and others, and what cooperation there were, what other rumors there were, the things they could prove, the things they could not prove. So I got quite interesting. I saw, amongst other things, that in Florida, in Broward County, he had been present, and he was active in the election of the local sheriff, and he apparently supported the local sheriff to be elected as head sheriff, and in return, not only were all the files against Lansky closed, but the sheriff sent the armored cars of the police in order to protect the cars with the money of Lansky when they brought the money from one gambling casino to another. I mean, all kinds of things which really were frightening. And so it's something that I wanted to prevent from happening in Israel. Yeah. Yes, I wanted to tell you, I mean, as I said, I hardly ever had routine cases. You know, when I was, that's after the Eichmann trial, people expected me to write something, and I wanted to, but then immediately the big espionage cases came up. And then there were these famous cases of, one of them, the famous Bengal case, which was, there was at the time a German professor, Görke. He was in Egypt, and he wanted to help the Egyptians to put up a factory for rockets, so that the rockets that could hit Israel with dangerous weapons and chemical gas and atomic weapons. And this man had a daughter, and that daughter lived in Switzerland. And an Israeli agent met this girl in a cafe in Basel, in Switzerland, and he tried to persuade her father to come back from Egypt. Now, she had told the police about that. The police were covering the tracks of this agent, and this agent was arrested and was charged with threatening the girl and with using sort of illegal methods to try to make her do things against her wish. And so I was sent to Switzerland to sort of take care of that case. We had a very well-known lawyer who appeared for him, he had some hesitation at first to accept me. He didn't want the commissar to give him instructions, but I managed to arrange a meeting with him, and we became good friends. And I'm still very good friends with his family. He's no longer alive, and I managed to prove before a Swiss court that this man had not done anything wrong. He had not threatened her. On the contrary, I explained to all the Swiss authorities it would have been a tactical mistake if he had threatened her, because she had told him that her father was afraid to come back because he was afraid that someone might hurt him. So on the contrary, the Israeli agent tried to convince her that if the man did come back, he didn't have to fear anything. Nothing would happen to him. Of course, he said, if he stays there and if he helps to create some rockets that might harm or could cause genocide in Israel, then of course, just like Eichmann stood trial, this man also could one day be brought to trial. So they convicted him of a very light technical offense, and there were some very friendly expressions towards Israel by the court and by the prosecutor who appeared in the trial, and that was a very interesting experience in itself. In addition, there were these two famous cases of one in Switzerland and one in Greece, where El Al planes were attacked by terrorists. In Switzerland, there were 5 terrorists at the airport of Zurich, and they opened fire. They killed the Israeli pilot, and there was an Israeli police representative, and he jumped out of the plane with a pistol only, and he ran towards these 5 or 6 terrorists. He killed one of them, and the Swiss charged him that he killed someone who had already been disarmed, and then the terrorists were, of course, put on trial. So I was asked by the Israel government to first of all see to it that the terrorists were properly punished, and to defend the Israeli. Well, that's a long story, but finally I managed to he was completely acquitted, and the terrorists got major sentences, and that was a very, very, very interesting case. I proved in court by making some examination too, that when the Israeli agent came over, that this Arab who was killed had pointed a machine gun at him, and he shot him first, and the Israeli agent, Rachamim, and the Arab fell down, and his gun slipped from his hands and was rolling down a slope that was there. That's why the witnesses who came later, they only saw this man lying there without arms. But in addition, what had happened was that immediately after the incident, on the evening of that day, the police officer in charge of Zurich airport appeared on television, and he was charged. He said people said there was some warning that an attack could be forthcoming, and why didn't you prevent it? And now a person was killed because of that. So in order to defend himself, he said, that was not necessary to kill him. We had already disarmed him. Now, the witnesses who were questioned on next day, they had heard that police officer. So that strengthened them in saying they saw that the man was not armed. But I managed to see to it that it was proved in court that the man was in fact armed, and Rachamim was acquitted. The police told me that they had overheard conversations, that they tried to kill me there in Switzerland. Well, I mean, to kill this Israeli Rachamim, and well, I somehow managed to get through the airport and get home safely. But that was also an interesting case. And then a few weeks later, there was an attack on an Al plane in Greece. And there's also an Israeli was killed. And at that time, that was the government of the famous colonels in Greece. And lots of pressure was used by the Arab states against the Greek government to close the file against the terrorists who had carried out that attack. And there was a rumor that the Greek government had already decided to close the file. So I was sent to prevent that. They said, well, you might end up in a concentration camp also, but anyway, I was there, which was a little bit even more difficult than in Switzerland. They spoke German, they understood my German. In Greece, I didn't understand the language. But anyway, I got on very friendly terms with the Greek prosecutor, and he decided to bring the case against these people, and he asked me to help him in preparing the case and the evidence. Well, that also took quite a few days. So anyways, so actually, when I think backwards, it was actually a period of sort of one adventurous situation after another, and I certainly don't regret about 29 years that I was in the State Attorney's office. The last 13 years of that, I was the Chief State Attorney of Israel.
Were you involved at all in the terrorism that occurred at the Olympic Games against the Israeli athletes? Was your office involved in that investigation at all?
Not in the investigation, but I had one very vivid memory about that. After I was sort of kicked out of Germany there in 1938, for about 30 years I didn't want to visit Germany, not even on transit. But then the person who later became the president of Germany, Gustav Heidemann, he came to Israel. He was then the Minister of Justice of Germany. And I was asked to show him the country, Israel, him and his wife. And we became very good friends. And after he left, I was invited to come to Germany, also to speak to people of the German parliament about the cancelling the statute of limitation to enable Nazis to be put on trial even at a later date. After I was there 2 weeks before this man was elected as president. And after the attack in the Olympic Games that you described, this president made a famous speech in a very official occasion, and he said that it's not enough to criticize what happened in Munich, but one has to sort of actively act against all the governments that were involved directly and indirectly in preparing and carrying out this terrible attack against the Israeli sportsmen. And so I sent him a telegram congratulating him on this, what I read about that he said that. So he sent me a reply, and he said, well, thank you very much, but you can't imagine what criticism was uttered against me, that I did say these things, because they said as a president I should not have expressed such a political opinion as I did then, and so on. I knew some of the people who were hurt there, but in the actual act of the crime committed in Munich, of course that's part of the German authorities who dealt that. I was not involved directly in the investigation.
May 1948, when the State of Israel was created, where are you at that time?
Well, actually, I was in London at the time, at the University College London. And well, I was a member of the Haganah, so when the moment the state was created and there was a danger that Israel might be attacked, I told the professors there that I had to leave, and I actually reported to the Jewish agency in London, and I was mobilized as a soldier. But then before I could leave, I got information that in order to save the manpower that had to go back to Europe to collect Jewish survivors who were collecting in some of the camps not far in the south of France, they wanted that I should carry out that job, and sort of every few days I said, when will I get the detailed instructions? They said, well, we'll call you and we'll do. So for a while I stayed in London because of that, but then afterwards I went back to serve in the Israel army.
What was it like? What was that period of time where you finally got the state of Israel, but at the same time you're being challenged from every neighboring country? Did you get were you confident that you could sustain this onslaught of Palestinian Arab attacks?
I'm sorry, at what period, which period are you referring to? During the World War?
No,
or afterwards?
After 1948.
Oh, afterwards when we were here. Well,
I mean, there's a lot going on.
Oh, that after. Well, look, I'm a little bit of I'm regarded as an incurable optimist. So I always thought we will finally overcome. Of course, there were moments during the time of the War of Independence and then before the Six-Day War. I remember when we were in Jerusalem during the famous Six-Day War. That was in 60. When was it? 60. Yes, 67. We heard the broadcasts on the other side, how they were preparing that they would divide up all our houses in Jerusalem and would kill us all and so on. But I trusted our military commanders and the military formations that they would do the job, and they did very successfully.
Very successfully. Along this timeline, you've had a chance to meet the power, the political power. Let me just throw out a few names to see if you have an impression. David Ben-Gurion.
Yes, I knew actually all the prime ministers very well. David Ben-Gurion, and Shimon Peres, and Rabin, and Begin. And of course, especially from 1969 till 1982, when I was appointed Justice of the Supreme Court, I was the Chief State Attorney of Israel. So of course I had daily contacts with all the ministers. And well, sometimes arguments here or there. I was very sort of saw the advantages, the really strong points in the character of every one of them. There was one thing I wanted to mention, especially, I mean, Menachem Begin, he was known as not a liberal character. His opinions were rather extreme, right-wing and so on. And there were occasions when I received, when action was brought against the Israel government for doing this or that or the other in the occupied territories, putting up settlements, territories that belonged to Arab private landowners, for instance, and so on. When I came to the conclusion after investigating this that these particular settlements were put up contrary to international law, and files were by the Arab local landowners applied to the Supreme Court, sitting as High Court of Justice, and I had to defend the government. And I came to the conclusion that what the government in these particular cases wanted to do was either contrary to international law or against some other law. So in these cases, I applied to the government to hear me, and I told them I cannot defend the government. And interestingly enough, more than anyone else that I came across, it was Menachem Begin, with all his strong opinions, you know, right-wing and so on, but he had a great respect for the rule of law. And then he said, if the state attorney says he cannot defend that, the rule of law is more important than anything else. And he cancelled decisions to put up settlements if I said that I cannot defend that. That was really very remarkable. The same thing which rather very much impressed me, that archbishop I told you about, there was an attempt to, he was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, but after a while there were some negotiations with the Vatican, and the Israelis thought maybe that would make a good impression if he was released. And it was discussed, and I objected to that. I said, this man, I mean, how can I charge any other ordinary person who smuggles arms into Israel? If this man, an archbishop, you know, if he is released, I see no justification after a short while when he was in prison to do that. But then a few years later, there was another attempt. The man had been ill in the meantime, and he had been already in prison 6 years, which meant that he was not far after getting sometimes a reduction of a third of the sentence. He could have been released anyway after a while. So I did not object so much anymore. But there was a meeting with Menachem Begin and with other people in this, ministers and the Attorney General and people at the head of the Secret Service and the Army. But then it was interrupted because there was some prime minister had arrived from another country. But later I heard that Begin had decided that the man should be released. And in the evening I got a phone call from Begin. He said, Mr. Bach, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that you were not happy with this. So I wanted to tell you about some additional information that I'd received there in the meantime. And I was much impressed by that. I mean, after all, what should he care if the state attorney is happy or not happy, if he thought it was right? But that he felt he had to do that and to try to get to peace, to put sort of my peace of mind at rest. I thought that was very impressive. Now, Ben-Gurion, his opinions were closer to mine politically, and I had some very interesting talks with him about many important decisions. And then, of course, same with Begin and Rabin. I saw Rabin just the day before he was murdered. We had a very interesting discussion about appointing new judges in the army, court and the army court martials. That also impressed me immensely. I mean, there were so many problems there before. I mean, and we had this meeting, and they summoned me in order to discuss, or to get information on the candidates for being judges in the Army Supreme Court. So Rabin came in, and I thought he would like to hear what I've got to say. He was prepared about every one of the candidates. He knew all the details. I mean, when he was so busy politically and otherwise, and there were these internal threats and others, and he had prepared that meeting. He knew the details of all the biographies of every one of these people. I must say that was very impressive. And of course, a terrible shock for me when what happened the day after that, when he was murdered.
When he was murdered, that trial, the forthcoming trial, were you involved in that at all?
Yes, of course. I did. The case itself, I was in charge of that. I had to decide. But legally, it was an easy case. Right. I mean, therefore it was clear. There were lots of pieces, lots of evidence. And it was more that I had to see to it that the press should not exceed their right to express opinions before the trial, and that there should be a fair trial for this man. And then when he was convicted, that there should be no real attempt to try to mitigate what he had done and so on. But that was not one of the, I mean, it was a terrifying experience, to know and to realize that how this crazy fellow could have done a thing like that. But from a legal point of view, as state attorney, that was rather an easy decision.
You got a life sentence? What happened to him? What was the sentence?
He got a life sentence, yes.
So
yes, we've abolished, in Israel, we've abolished the death sentence for murder, ordinary murder. We only have the death sentence still for Nazi crimes, for crimes of genocide, for treason in wartime, and for terrorist acts. And in spite of the most terrible terrorist attacks that came before us, the only person who has ever been sentenced to death and executed remains Eichmann until this very day.
Was there some discussion as to the sentencing of Eichmann and that the death sentence would be given? Was there an issue whether we should just suffer and life sentence?
Yes, well, we received information from all over the world, lots of people advising us to do this or that or the other, and some people said no, that there should be no capital punishment in Israel, it should be abolished. And some people said for political reasons we have to show that. Most people thought the other way around. And then there were also inside Israel there were discussions. All right, I myself, when I studied in England, I actually worked on a thesis. Of course, it was many years before Eichmann was caught, about 12 years before that. And I, in doing this investigation, I visited the prison where a man was kept who was executed in the next morning. And I spent all night with that man, a man who had committed a burglary about 10 years before that, and he thought the house was empty. And then suddenly an old woman appeared who was there, and she started to shout, and he hit her and he killed her. And the question whether that was murder or not murder occupied the authorities there, and it took a long time, appeal and cross-appeal and re-hearing and so on. Then finally he was convicted and sentenced to death. He had no family apparently, so I spent with him the whole night. I played cards with him and I heard his story. And he told me how he had become a different person. He started to write poems and how these things would never happen again and so on. So I spoke to the hangman who had to carry out the death sentence, and the doctor who told me that all his life he'd been thinking how to save people's lives, and he had to examine the throat of that man to see what strength of rope to use in order that the death should occur quickly. He said it was terrifying, and I spoke to the governor and others, and it was really a frightening experience. And I wrote then against the death sentence, but also, of course, possibility of a doubt. And I mean, all the other things were known arguments for and against. But I then added at the time I would be of a different opinion about genocide, when there's a danger that a person might have caused the death of thousands or more, or hundreds of thousands of people. And then in Israel there was a discussion also amongst members of the prosecution. If the appeal is dismissed and there was a request for pardon, and let's say if the president gives a pardon, all right, then that. But if not, when should the execution take place? Mm-hmm. So some of my colleagues thought that we should then postpone it for a month or so and carry it out. I was against that, because I was afraid that once the death sentence is final, that the Nazis somewhere in the world, whether it's in America or in South America or in I don't know, in Hawaii or in Portugal or somewhere, they might kidnap maybe a Jewish child.
Yep.
And say that they will execute that child if we execute Eichmann. So I suggested that what should be done is to wait till the president decides, and if the president decides to reject the pardon, the request for pardon, then to broadcast that at 11 o'clock at night, and an hour later to carry out the execution. And the government accepted that, and this was in fact carried out like that. I didn't tell that to my wife, this whole story, but I didn't know, of course, when the president would decide. But on that day I was in my bathroom, and suddenly at 11 o'clock at night my wife called me and said, you know, they just said on the radio that the president had refused the request for pardon. And then I realized that this was now the moment when the sentence would be carried out. So I felt that I was getting a bit pale after all, because I mean, I'd never been instrumental, and I hope I never will be instrumental again in carrying out the death sentence against any person. So that was not easy. I must also add, when I was asked by the Attorney General to draft a first version of our request to impose the death sentence on Eichmann, I mean, I had no doubts whatsoever that we have to do that. And the reasoning, when I wrote the reasoning about this, the obsession of that person, the complete identification with this criminal scheme, and how he felt that he was the chosen man to destroy the Jewish people and so on. But when I came to the final sentence, therefore, we request that this man should be sentenced to death, I must admit that my hand did shake a little bit. But anyway, these are some very specific and sensitive moments connected with that trial.
Your memoirs, are you likely to write any?
Well, I was immediately after the Eichmann trial, and every time when there was a special case, I was asked to write something, and I never got down to it because immediately some other thing came up. But actually, now after my retirement, again, retirement, people thought that I would have some rest, but I don't. I want very much not to fall into the trap of being busier now than before retirement, but if I would accept 10% of what every day comes up for me, this committee and that committee, and arbitrations and mediations and interviews and visits abroad and things like that, I don't complain about that, because I feel it's better to be a little bit too busy than too little. But I didn't have so much time. But actually, there is now someone, a very well-known authoress, a woman. She wrote some interesting books also on people with some historical background, and she wants to write something about my life and about my experience and my cases. And I met her quite a number of times, told those things about it, and she made some research on her own account, and she wants to write this now, of course, first of all in Hebrew, but maybe that will finally be translated also into other languages, like English and perhaps other languages. And also there's some university that want to put out a book on, they apply to lots of other of judges and attorneys and other people in Israel and abroad to write something about their experience with me and about some of my judgments and some other legal points that they thought of interest, and to publish that also as a remembrance book on me, on Gabriel Bach. So, I hesitate not too much to interfere in that, but still, it's quite pleasant that people think about that.
I would say so. We've had an incredible career, and I'm sure we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here today. We're thrilled that you accepted the invitation to come over here for a week and come to Chautauqua, expose you to a little different environment, and to meet some interesting people.
Well, very, very happy that
We do the same as you do. We are very thrilled to be here and in this wonderful place and with wonderful people.
Yeah, I want to say it was a very great experience to come here. And when I walk here around through the streets, I can't even define exactly what is so fascinating about it. Not this house or that house, but the whole impression of the place, and the music and the interesting performances that we come across, and the places themselves. That everything together is really absolutely fascinating, and we very much enjoyed every moment. We're here. We're very grateful that that opportunity was given to us.
Well, it's been a highlight for us, trust me. And I suspect that within this whole community, they've enjoyed your presence so much, you'll probably get another invitation soon. So don't get too busy.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, and we wish everyone here sort of lots of similar successful years and a lot of satisfaction in every sphere.
Well, you're great. This has been fabulous. In fact, I don't think they'll have a bigger crowd in this facility than they did Thursday afternoon. You know, the crowd just flowed over the porch, onto the lawn, into the street, on the other side of the street.
Yes, so I saw was yes, a bit sorry for the inconvenience that was perhaps caused, but it certainly was encouraging to see that so many people were interested to take part in these meetings.
Well, as I said, it's such a great thing to have a timeline from the Nuremberg trial to the Eichmann trial to what Eli's doing today. You know, it's just a wonderful continuum.
Yes, the connection with Eli, of course, Rosenbaum. Ever since he, a couple of years ago, invited us to the Washington Holocaust Museum. There he invited me to speak on the Eichmann trial, and he invited the person, Peter Malkin. He was the one who actually took part in the capture of Eichmann and bringing him from the Argentine to Israel. And since then we've been all the time in contact, and of course very interesting in what he's doing now to Munich. That's a case that I was intimately connected with during my service in Israel.
You also had to connect with the attorney, the young attorney, the junior attorney for Eichmann.
Yeah.
Where is he now? Is he in?
You mean the
this?
Oh yes. Well, first of all, I want to add that we had a very friendly relationship with Mr. Windy Harris now, who was the number 2 prosecutor next to Jackson, Mr. Jackson, who is unfortunately no longer alive, but Mr. Windy Harris, who these days celebrates his 97th birthday, and I want to send him best congratulations for that. And we met him.
Will he come now?
We hope so.
And we managed to meet him in a place in Nuremberg, where he spoke about the Nuremberg trial and I about the Eichmann trial, and the same afterwards again in Frankfurt. So that was, of course, fascinating to hear from him, to compare notes about the two trials. And then there were 2 German lawyers who were appointed from Marburg. We met with Mr. Windy Harris, and that's where we met you, Greg Peterson. And I'm very happy that we met you, and the friendship that developed since then, and which was certainly not diminished but encouraged by our nice combined experiences that we had this week. Then I should like to mention that the German defense counsels of Eichmann, who were appointed, of course, at the expense of the Israel government, one of them, Dr. Savatius, he was one of the important defense counsels in the Nuremberg trials. He defended Mr. Saukel, the German Minister of Labor and the National Socialist Party, etc., and was a great expert in Nazi matters. Unfortunately, he also is no longer alive, but his young assistant, Dieter Wechtenbruch, he, yes, we of course, we fought one against another in the trial, but we had also not more than a correct, but a really friendly relationship. And when I reached my retiring age, my daughter made a surprise party for me. She managed to get in touch with the young German defense counsel of Eichmann, who called me there at this special ceremony. Wow. and said how friendly still his feelings are, and how friendly he feels towards Israel, etc. And then when we had this meeting now in Nuremberg together with Mr. Windy Harris, then this man who lives in Munich, he also invited me to come to his place, and after about 45 years we managed to re-establish our contact, and he showed me all the neighborhood of Munich and his home. And we still have a friendly relationship. He admired Israel very much, and he even had intentions to live there for a period, and somehow it didn't materialize. But anyway, the relations with him are also very cordial.
What was his impressions 45 years after the fact of the trial? Did he think Eichmann got a fair trial? Was there any, was he impressed as to how the activities, the procedures were used during the trial?
Yes. Well, I think there's no doubt about that. I've never heard from anyone who thought that he was not given a fair trial. The judges, in fact, were very extreme. Sometimes we almost felt a little bit too extreme. They did not permit the prosecution to bring a single piece of evidence which was not directly relevant to the trial. Of course, we wanted to show in this trial what happened during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. But there, what made life easier for us there, that the accused person was someone who was really connected with every aspect of this terrible and criminal scheme. And I've very often said that if I'd carried out that investigation, because I was the legal advisor of the police bureau that was entrusted with the carrying out the investigation against Eichmann. So for 9 months I lived in this prison next to him, and I saw all the evidence that was there. Now, if we had carried out that investigation without any suspected person being present, man would have told me afterwards, you can have one person to put on trial in order really through this case to show what happened in the Holocaust. There's no doubt that I would have chosen Eichmann, because rather than people of a higher rank, who were in a way perhaps more responsible for taking the original and accepting the original orders and giving the original instructions and orders, because he was the one who really was entrusted with carrying out the Holocaust all during the war. And I've very often mentioned in the Gestapo there were lots of departments, and everyone had a leader, and they were all the time changed by rotation. The only one who was there all the time, all during the war, was Adolf Eichmann as head of the Jewish department. So that, of course, was something very special. But the judges, as I said, were very strict. And if there was any evidence or any document that they thought was not directly connected with Eichmann, they forbade that. I'm sometimes asked by people, yes, but you brought witnesses from the death camps, like Auschwitz and Majdanek and Treblinka and Sobibor and Belzec. Now, Eichmann was not present during these carrying out. So you did bring evidence that was not directly connected with him. Sometimes people say that, but that's completely wrong, because I don't think even you have to be a jurist in order to understand that if we charge Eichmann with being an accomplice to murder, then of course we have to show that he gave the instructions to round up all the Jews and to send them to the death camps and send the gas and do this and be generally in charge of the whole procedure. But in order to find him guilty of complicity of murder, you have to show that these people were in fact murdered. And therefore what happened in the death camps was direct evidence, even if Eichmann was not personally present during the carrying out of the death in the gas chambers, etc. That happens every day. If you charge someone with murder because he gave instructions to someone to kill another person, then even if that person is killed not in the presence of the accused, that is of course relevant evidence. So therefore all this, everything that we did show. And also I never forget the first moment of that trial, when these judges came into the courtroom with the Israel emblem behind them. And that man whose only object in life had become the destruction of that people, the Jewish people, when he got up and stood to attention before an Israeli, sovereign Israeli court, before a sovereign Israeli state, the importance of the creation of the State of Israel, and all it meant, became clearer to me at that moment than at any moment that had preceded that, more than any demonstration or any parade or any article or anything else. And I think that was a feeling which was shared by most people in Israel on that day.
Did you and Hausner have to spend a lot of time regarding the strategy of the presentation of the prosecution? Was there much debate as to how you were going to conduct it?
Yeah, well, debate is perhaps exaggerated, but of course there were three of us who actually carried out the case from the point of view of handling the witnesses, questioning the witnesses in court, arguing in court, and we divided it up between us. Mr. Hausner, he was as the Attorney General, leading prosecutor. I was number two, and then the district attorney of Tel Aviv, Mr. Yaakov Bar-O, he was the third one. And of course we discussed everything from a technical and from a strategic point of view, and that the case shouldn't take too long, but not too short. I mean, for instance, we had an argument at the time. There was some opinion that maybe we take some very special witnesses, but that the rest should be based on documents, and that in some of the countries it's enough, some of the countries of Europe, it's enough if we hand in the document to show how many Jews were murdered there. I objected to that. I said you have, in order to give a complete picture to the court and to everyone, also the surroundings, of what really happened during the Holocaust, I insisted that in connection with every country in Europe, there should at least be one live witness who could tell describe the atmosphere and what happened to his family, and what happened there, because only then can a complete and true picture be given of what happened in this terrifying occurrence, where in which connection I must say that whatever explanation is given, to me it's only partial. It's so mysterious how these things could have happened, how people could have carried out these terrible things. And therefore I insisted that there should be a live witness. Even I remember, in connection with Denmark. In Denmark, for instance, the Germans failed to carry out the murder of all the Jews, because when it was decided to deport the Jews from Denmark in '43 to the east, the neighbors of these people took their Jewish neighbors and brought them in little rowing boats to Sweden. Now, interesting enough, Eichmann, even when he was a prisoner here, and he told his story to the police officer who interrogated him, he could not forgive what happened there, and that the local SS man, Werner Best, was not sufficiently sort of concentrating on really killing, causing the death of every Jew. I didn't know this man Best, but my impression was that in 1943, to get out of Denmark for Germany, the butter and the cheese and the eggs was more important than killing every Jew. And so he reported that these people had escaped. So Eichmann said to the police officer, look what sort of people there are. Look at this man Best. There he was in Berlin, he was so small, and then he comes to Copenhagen and makes difficulties for me, as if to expect that the Israeli police was that you poor man, everyone tried to prevent you from killing every last Jew. I mean, the sort of special moments that are difficult to forget, but that it really showed the whole attitude of that man towards these terrible offenses.
This may be a crazy question, but you probably got closer to him during the 9 months or the months he was in prison, and through the police investigation, you got closer. Was there anything about Eichmann which was admirable, a characteristic you said, you know, whether it's his loyalty, is there anything there that sort of you kind of said there's something positive about him?
Well, I must confess I didn't find, from my experience, what I saw, something that was admirable. I mean, the way in which he stood there in a difficult position, being here in Israel and talked in a normal manner. When he came before me, there was nothing that I would really regard as admirable, but I mean, he somehow accepted the fact that he is a prisoner and has to act as one. Mm-hmm. But when I sat opposite him and I made some kind of movement that he thought I wanted to get up, he immediately stood up to attention. Again, not out of fear or trying to find favor in our eyes, no. But that was for him. He's a prisoner, and therefore, just like in the morning, he has for his breakfast, he usually got three slices of bread. So sometimes, if he could eat only 2, he asked for permission not to eat the last one. So he thought that that was part of being a prisoner. But all in all, I must say that everything around him was very despicable. Yeah. I mean, I told people around, I prepared a documentary film, which was shown during the trial. And for 3 days and 3 nights, I saw all the films that existed and made a film of about 45 minutes. And out of fairness to the accused, I I wanted to show Eichmann and his lawyers the film before it's shown to the court. So the evening before we intended to put this in, we had Eichmann brought it to the courtroom, and together there were also some journalists present, and we showed that film. Now, I knew the film, so I didn't look at the film so much. I looked at Eichmann to see how he would react. And he was completely impassive. He looked at the corpses in Bergen-Belsen and the gas chambers and the spectacles and the children's shoes and all these terrifying things there in Auschwitz. And he didn't react. And then suddenly he spoke in a very excited manner to his warden, who sat next to him. So after it was over, I called this warden. I said, why was he suddenly so excited? And he said, yes, he said that he had been promised that he would never be taken into the courtroom unless he wears his dark blue suit. And here they take him out in his gray suit. And they shouldn't promise him something like that if they can't keep it. And he has to protest most vehemently about that. I mean, that was something very typical about it. And then also when you speak about the fair trial, I mean, his lawyers told me something, I mean, we went through millions of documents from all the German ministries and so on. And sometimes I came across a document that formally I thought legally that might be of interest to the defense, like obeying orders and things like that. So I sent it to, like I did in every criminal case, I sent these documents to the defense counsel. And he told me, although he showed it to Eichmann. So Eichmann asked him, where did you get these documents from? He said, the prosecutor gave it to me. He said, Eichmann almost fainted. He said, how? The prosecutor in Israel gave you documents that he thought might be important for the defense? He said, yes, he thought it was. I said, I don't deserve any credit for that because we do that in every criminal case in Israel. But we did it here as well. So I think from the point of view of that we really, justice was done. And some people said, yes, but you're judges. After all, I'm sure that as Jews they have emotions. I said, I think, I would say that any judge who could hear evidence like this and occurrence like that and not feel any emotions, I think he is not fit to be a judge, whichever country he sits in. Of course, you have to be objective, and you have to give the defense every possibility to defend himself. Well, that I think was done, and I think the judgment itself speaks for itself.
When you picked up the book for the very first time, Adolf Eichmann trial, Banality of Evil, Hannah Arendt, you started reading it, how did you feel? What was your emotions?
Well, emotions when I read, and what really shocked me most of all, it's not so much, she's entitled to her opinions if they are even contrary to what we believe in, but that there were lots and lots of the most important documents that were given there in a completely false and sometimes absolutely opposite from what was written there. And then I remembered, I mean, I didn't know her before the trial. And I heard when, a few days before the trial started, I was told there was a lady from, a philosopher from America. She had come to Israel to hear the trial and to write something against the trial before it started. And so I said, well, if this woman has, if this lady has some problem, I'll gladly talk to her. So after 2 days, someone came back and said she said she was not prepared to speak to anyone of the prosecution before the case started. All right, so I said, well, maybe she doesn't have to. In that case, of course, she can hear the trial. And also, I gave the instructions that she should have access to all the documents that we put in, that she could also read the documents and form her own opinion on the strength of all that she hears and reads. That was what I understood. And then when I read her book, and there was a book written by one of the members of the prosecution team, Jacob Robinson. He didn't he didn't question witnesses, but he was an expert in historical matters. He actually visited in the he lived in the United States. He was born in Lithuania, but he lived most of his life in the United States, and we summoned him from there. He was a historian and also an expert on international law, and he wrote a book, And the Crooked Shall Be Made Straight. All that about the Hannah Arendt book. And there he describes in 250 pages or so how she falsified the main documents that we used during the trial. Anything which did not fit in with her opinions, somehow she brought in a completely false manner in this book. And also the opinions, you know, when you read that by painting Eichmann so black, that thereby we diminished, that's what she wrote, that we, the Israeli prosecution, thereby diminished the guilt of Hitler and Himmler and Heydrich and these people. I think that's, sorry to say, but it looks like absolute nonsense. The fact that the other heads of the German departments were changed by rotation, and that he was kept as head of the Jewish department because they knew of this obsession of his and the way in which this fanaticism, where he gave everything the worst and most frightful interpretation, that people like Hitler and Himmler, of course, who were more guilty because they were the ones who were the originators of the whole idea of the Holocaust. Eichmann was the one who had to carry it out. But the fact that they kept a man like that in this position, that doesn't detract from their guilt. It's the other way around. That they wanted there someone with extreme fanaticism, the way would carry out everything, without any conscience influencing him. Then that certainly is absolutely wrong to say that that detracts from their guilt. And everything else, I mean, most of the things that she said wrote there when she tried to show that Eichmann was really already obeyed orders. I spent a lot of time actually really in the courtroom itself and before that really examining this position. Was he only a person to carry out orders? That would still have made him guilty, but it might have influenced might have been a mitigating circumstance as far as the punishment was concerned. But here we saw that, especially towards the end of the war, this man became completely identified with this. And he told his friends, I know the war is lost, but I'm still going to win my war. And then he went to Auschwitz to get the death rate there increased from 10,000 a day to 12,000 a day. I mean, that was typical for this man. And the fact that we showed that in court was justified, and it certainly didn't detract from the guilt of the superior people like Hitler and Himmler.
Did you ever meet her? Was there any sort of follow-up discussions with? Did she ever come to?
With Hannah Arendt? No, I never met her.
What a life you guys have lived! My gosh. Lived and loved. Yeah, I love it.
Yes, I was, many people, I also said that on the day on which I finished my service in the Israeli Supreme Court. I've seen it from experiences. There are lots of people, either they look forward, I mean, as longingly, like sometimes children saying, oh, if only we were grown up already, or looking backward with nostalgia at the past. Everything in the past was more important and more interesting and more efficient and more honest and so on. That's what many people say. They are the, yes. With me, it was never like that. Whichever stage I reached, I always thought that was very good. The best thing, I was very pleased at what I did before, but then I was very pleased also at the new experience. I mean, even as a child, I remember when sometimes my friends said, look, so much homework and all these examinations. And I said, look, we'll never have it as good as now. Our parents are looking after us. And we have a great time and we can study and play and all this is wonderful. Much better than anything we'll have in the future. And then as a student, of course, and in the army I enjoyed it. Then in the state attorney's office, I had sort of really a life full of adventures. And then when I came to the courthouse, the idea that I could now give norms that would be determining future cases in hundreds of thousands of cases, not less. And I must say, the moment I finished that, and I had the impression I can now sit at home and listen to watch a basketball match on television without feeling I still have 10 files to read for tomorrow morning. That also I found desirable. And then again, things came up that I now sometimes a little bit too busy perhaps, but it's better to be a little bit too busy than too little. And so then also my experience, including this wonderful experience I'm having now, that's part of the so-called retirement. So I was always very happy at every stage in life that I had reached.
What a great philosophy, and obviously you have that same one as well.
No.
You like to relax?
Yes, from time to time, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'm always, behind him and always running after him. And I must say that there is a lot to be learned from him. He is an incurable optimist.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific. And wow, I can't thank both of you enough. This has just been a magical week, and I look forward to the time when we can get together in Israel, or
I hope so
maybe
too.
get you back here for.
Well, one of the continents. I hope that we'll meet again soon, and we'll be in the meantime. I hope we'll be in contact all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we have a lot of stuff to send to you. from your
thank
visit here this week, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, you with all your assistants.
Well, thank you.